I met a wonderful person who was talking about FemTech. And I thought, oh, women in tech, that's exactly what I want to be. And she said, no, female health and technology. So women's health in particular.
But something interesting happens when that excuse disappears, when the ecosystem is mapped, when institutions publish the reports, when the market is finally visible.
In 2024, only about 26% of women in Southeast Asia were familiar with the term FemTech at all.
A market can be massive and still remain invisible, not because the need isn't there, but because no one has built the infrastructure to make it legible. This is Lindsay Davis, founder of FemTech Association Asia, and this episode is about what ecosystem building really does before capital arrives. I'm Marianne South, and this is Blind Spot Capital. Let's talk about what has to be built before capital can move. When women's health markets are invisible, capital has an excuse. There is no data, there's no track record, there's no proof it's real. But something interesting happens when that excuse disappears, when the ecosystem is mapped, when institutions publish the reports, when the market is finally visible. This conversation sits in that space. It's about what ecosystem building in women's health really does, about why regional infrastructure matters long before capital shows up, and about what happens when you build bridges instead of replicas. My guest today is Lindsay Davis, founder of FemTech Association Asia, now the largest specialist network for women's health innovation across the region. But before she was building ecosystems, she was simply paying attention. And that's where this story really starts. Lindsay, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. It's exciting to have this awesome resource open to so many of us and to be able to listen to you, your expertise, especially with that finance and capital and investment lens, which so many of us, need more of in the women's health space. So thanks for what you're doing too.
Oh, Lindsay, thank you so much. We've been trying to have this conversation for a long time. So I'm really excited that we're finally having it. So Lindsay, and it's actually quite a good time because you've just published, as we were talking before the camera started rolling, you've just published this 62-page report on FemTech in Southeast Asia with the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, which I think I should say, I hate to say this, maybe I shouldn't, but it has been my bedtime reading for the past few nights. Now, I know the report isn't exactly a thriller, but for me, I think once I kind of got into it, it was kind of hard to put down. And I'd love to talk to you about that. So I'd love to get into that in a moment. But before FemTech Association Asia, before building the ecosystem and reports, who were you when you first arrived in Asia?
It's a great question. I moved over here definitely looking to transition my career. So I had been in the luxury space for, over a decade, had always worked with premium and luxury brands. And I was really excited to move to Asia. I'm originally from the US, became British in 2014, lived in London for a long time, ran a global franchise network, so did a ton of travel for work. So I've always had a really international career. So when I moved to Singapore, I thought, well, I think I want to get more involved in tech. And I didn't know what that would look like. That could have been SUSTech, FinTech, Agritech. I wasn't sure what that was going to look like. But I knew I wanted to start learning more and getting more involved in tech. So with that career transition and that excitement, I moved to Singapore in January of 2020. We were in lockdown by March of 2020, full-time lockdown. So that really shifted the roles I was looking at. And part of that was actually continuing to kind of do a lot of the moderating and panels that I had done before. Now, at one of those events, I met a wonderful person who was talking about FemTech. And I thought, oh, women in tech, that's exactly what I want to be. And she said, no, female health and technology. So women's health in particular. So I started looking into it and saw that whilst there were individuals involved, founders, investors, parts of the government, there was really no kind of unified group saying, okay, let's build this community together. Let's grow this ecosystem. Let's put some standards in place for how we approach the market and build, the startup community and link it with government agencies, with corporates, corporate partners, with investors. And so that's really where the idea came from, was just literally looking around and seeing that I've always been passionate about, gender equity and gender equality, but then you layer on top of that just such an obvious gap that we had not pursued here. And there it was. So I started FemTech Association Asia.
Wow. So you weren't thinking about women's health at all?
No, I wasn't, but I think always in my mind, I've had women's leadership, which I talk a lot about women's leadership, women at work, I talk a lot about, women in board positions, I'm very passionate about, and making sure that we have, equality and equal representation across all, genders, races, et cetera, in the workplace, as well as in charities, as well as in the home life, making sure that everyone's doing their part. So really, it's just seeing that as something that we grew, but actually saying, okay, there's this huge world of gender equality and gender equity, but where do I see the biggest gap, and what's the most attainable for someone who doesn't have experience in isn't a clinician, isn't a nurse by trade. I don't have that academic institution PhD background. What could that look like for someone like me? And I realized kind of that thread that we talk about in our careers has always been community building. So obviously through luxury brands and building their communities for them, or starting loyalty programs for premium brands, or building communities in general, which I've always really enjoyed. And so I've kind of put that skill to use to grow this ecosystem.
Yeah. So when did you realize that building this community around women's health wasn't just something that was interesting, but something that mattered?
Well, I think the first example is, again, like I mentioned, I'm not a doctor. And when I launched FemTech Association Asia, the number of people who came up to me and said, hey, I'm experiencing these symptoms. What do you think it is? And I just thought, oh my goodness, you need to go to your medical professional for that. But the fact that people were coming to me as a resource about pretty personal things, we could see there was a gap in the consumer knowledge. There was a gap that there's major market demand that no one's fulfilling. So when we look at that, we look at both the education side, but also just the gap of what's being provided. And then we layer on top of that again, back to the gender, we hear a lot of women talking about feeling dismissed by their doctors, or maybe just not being able to get to the reason they're feeling poorly, or, what's not the usual feeling for them. So it's such a personal thing. So I think women's health, I feel, was a gap because of the experience I had in talking with people, but moreover, just, it was kind of this thing that had a bit more stigma and taboo around it. And bit by bit, we're moving that forward from, kind of talking openly about, maternal care to reproductive care. Now fertility is a topic. And now we're talking about menopause. You can literally see, like, each year there's a different category that's opening wide, that's making these topics more normalized for conversation.
You're based in Singapore. That's it. And when I think about Singapore, it's a global hub for healthcare, for biotech, for capital. So help me understand this. Why wasn't there already infrastructure for women's health innovation? Because you talked about building this community where we bring together, investors, founders, corporate partners. Why wasn't there already this infrastructure?
It's a really great question. I think it comes back to, in Southeast Asia, reports we've run in partnership with Milu Insight shared with us that, first of all, this was as of 2024. And keep in mind, I started this in 2021. In 2024, only about 26% of women in Southeast Asia were familiar with the term femtech at all. So when we're even talking about the term, even in the industry, it wasn't recognized. And again, this term was just coined in about 2015, 2016 by the wonderful Ida Tin. So when we look at the fact that people weren't even using the term, I think it was kind of in the healthcare space, but not personalized to women. I think the second thing is we saw a lot of the founders creating these solutions because they saw the gap. They said no one's, helping people who need STI testing from home in a convenient, affordable way, these types of things. So it was very practical to start. But again, some of that taboo might have been there. So I think diving in, maybe the next point would just be time. Again, I moved here. I left my last job, moved here, didn't have a job yet. So I actually had the time to commit to launching this, because the reality is, and I say this with, now we're in our fifth year, going into our fifth year.
Yes.
It's a lot of time. It's a lot of effort. It takes a real commitment to be consistent. And so I think that is something that I've been fortunate to be able to, along with my community building expertise, actually have a bit of time that I could commit to it, especially in those first couple of years to build the network.
Yeah. So What existed at the time when you started the association, FemTech Association Asia? What existed at the time, and maybe what didn't?
Good question. So we had about 41 roughly companies,
Mm,
femtech companies in
mm,
Southeast Asia. And in Southeast Asia, I'm talking about Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand.
mm-hmm,
So 41 companies. So quite small if you think across all those companies.
mm-hmm,
Now we're 111. Now I know that
mm,
everyone's thinking, oh, that's years gone by and it's only 111, but these things are slow moving. And I am
mm.
seeing it's almost like exponential growth, the number of businesses that I'm seeing launching in Singapore, launching in Vietnam, launching in Indonesia, which is really exciting. So people are starting to see that it's an industry that they can enter, so
Yes.
that's really exciting. So when I first came, a lot of it was CPG based. So a lot of
Mm-hmm,
menstrual pads and menstrual care.
mm-hmm,
Again, what we're seing now is much more technically advanced. We're seeing, kind of that low tech entry point for a lot of people was the best way to go.
mm-hmm.
Now, what we're seeing is more of the diagnostics, more of the medical devices, the apps. Of course, when I started, there were 6 apps in all of
Wow.
Southeast Asia. 6. Now, almost every company has an app. So, I mean, that just shows the difference in the growth and the technology. And I guess that's what makes Asia really exciting
Yes.
is just how quickly the market grows and changes. And of course, it makes it hard to stay on top of everything. But what a gift to get to be here and to get to work on reports, studying the market, and get to work with these amazing founders, these amazing investors, corporate partners, ecosystem builders. Like I've met so many amazing people, and of course you. Who knew?
Yes.
I need
Who
people
knew?
in right. So how great is that? So yeah, so it's been great.
That's no, but I picked that up as well, reading the report, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. But I think what I took away, and I was quite optimistic about it, was just the growth, that's happened in the short space of time. So that's very encouraging.
Absolutely. And I think one other thing I should mention
Hmm.
is to give Japan a lot of credit. I
Right.
think Japan was an early mover in the space for when I'm thinking about the region.
Yeah.
Great representation, great inclusion. I was fortunate to go to a parliamentary session that was discussing women's health
Hmm.
a few years back. So, to give Japan credit, there's a lot of innovation coming out of there in women's health and a lot of discussion and dialogue around women's health, a lot of policy around women's health. So actually, Japan's been a really amazing case study for us to look at and really, say, wow, that's an incredible leader in the space for Asia. So that would be the other thing I'd say when I started is really seeing kind of Japan as that leader. And now we're seeing kind of other markets starting to move up and do those same things.
Yeah. I mean, you've talked about in the report. I think, as I said, it was very encouraging to see just the trend and how much has happened, and how much change has occurred in the last couple of years in women's health in Southeast Asia. But you also mentioned the sort of 5 major challenges, and I wanted to talk to you about those challenges because you've talked about access to finance. I think clearly in this women's health industry, finance is a challenge, I think, across the board. But you also talk about stigma, awareness and stigma, and social media censoring and ecosystem support. Can you talk to us about, those challenges and how it plays out, in Southeast Asia?
Definitely. I mean, we know through our research that 52% of women in Southeast Asia are hesitant or fearful of discussing women's health out of fear of judgment or shame.
Hmm.
So if we see over half of the population is or those with women's healthcare needs inclusively,
Hmm.
if individuals feel like they can't even talk about it because they're going to be shamed, how do we progress healthcare? Now, this is really where, again, in the report, we talk about the role of government
Hmm.
and how positive it can be in normalizing the conversation. So, an example that we have is the white paper out of Singapore that discussed how to basically advance women in all aspects of life, but especially looking at the workplace. And so a lot of it was discussing things like, maternity leave and making sure that that's respected and
Hmm.
making sure that women are given access to come back and training to upskill in order to make sure they're not missing out while they're away. So I think a lot of the initiatives we see is we automatically go to FemTech being underfunded, which I do agree with, by the way. There's
Hmm.
certainly no lack of that.
Yes.
But we can also look at, engagement in women's health has been quite low. And so I think, again, as women are becoming more senior, and we talk about millennials a lot, which I love younger generations because these are the voices we need. And as these women move into senior positions, they start feeling, perimenopause or menopause. All of a sudden that dialogue opens up because they've kind of worked through and said, no, we need a nursing room. Or we need fertility support because we want to be moms.
Yes.
Now we need a nursing room. Now we need to make sure you bring us back into the workplace with fair and equal treatment. Now we need to make sure that we're cared for during the perimenopause years and our aging years. So I think those voices of younger generations have been very powerful in Asia.
Yes.
And I think also we've seen a lot of strength from the government here in Singapore getting a lot more involved in women's health and really driving initiatives and policies that are supporting women. And in turn, I think we really do see a lot of that in, Vietnam's engagement, very high in women's health, a lot of support for startups we see in Indonesia and Malaysia as well. So, there's a lot of markets doing really great work. And even when we look at China, we see a ton coming out of China now and really some really positive tech. South Korea also a market leader. So I could go on and on. I mean, again, I just think this region is so exciting, not only because of the innovation, the founder talent, but also just very digitally savvy,
Yes.
and people who see opportunity and act on it. And there are these entire markets that I'm always so surprised we don't have more people trying to, in the FemTech space, trying to enter markets in Asia because so many of them have, great audiences and underserved markets.
Yeah. And so when you think about the challenges, where would you say are some of the emerging priorities off the back of that?
I think the first thing is, how are we building interest in the FemTech space that it's not just impact, charitable giving, oh, look at me, I'm supporting others. There's actually a massive underserved market that is a commercial opportunity. So I think the first thing we need to do is start pivoting the mindset around women's health. And that comes from the consumer having demand for solutions. And that also comes, of course, from the startups entering the space and making sure that we're not just positioning, based on, wanting to make impact, when actually what an investor wants to hear is, are you going to make me money? And of course, everyone loves the impact side. I'm not saying that's not great too.
Yes.
But the reality is we put our money in places when we invest that are going to have returns. So I'd say the first thing is making sure that we're looking at FemTech as a commercial opportunity. The second thing is, I think, going back to, again, how we find support. And I think a lot of that, I'm curious to see what will happen with insurers over the next few years, or healthcare, kind of healthcare support.
Yes.
And dollars and cents. We look at, it's actually more expensive to be a woman when it comes to healthcare. As most things in life, it's very expensive to be a woman. And I think how we address that will be very interesting to see. So the second kind of open topic that I think about a lot is insurance.
I see the priority, and how do I say this? I don't see them as challenges, actually. I see them as opportunities to engage with the space. I wanted to talk to you about something else that you highlighted on the report, which was the social media censoring. Can you talk to me about how that plays out in Southeast Asia? I mean, we see it across the board, also in Europe, in the US. And I think recently, the Center for Intimacy Justice published a report about social media censoring. But I wanted to get how this plays out in your world as well.
I mean, the reality is I think with FemTech is most markets around the world experience the same things. I would say most of the way we have limitations on social media or bans on social media or limitations on social media, all these things, I think that's pretty consistent around the world because, a lot of these policies are run off similar platforms, whether it be a Facebook or what Meta now, excuse me. God, that showed my age. I'm talking about my CD collection next, my record collection.
Exactly.
So, I think a lot of us have this, like when it comes to online censorship or social media censorship, I think that's pretty consistent around the world. I would say where Asia differs, and this is the obvious one, is like culturally and with religion it differs. right? And these types of things. So I would say, what we need to look at, where I say I'm going to reflect on what you just said, which is opportunity rather than challenge, is one, the opportunity for connectivity. And so that's the first thing FemTech Association Asia is really good at, is we actually know people in these markets in Asia, that if people want to learn and grow and connect and launch their business and market entry, we can help with all of that. And so I think that that's the first thing, just to kind of pitch it from an organization side.
Yes.
But to answer your question about kind of maybe other cultural nuances that we have, I think we have a really high trust in our medical providers on this side of the world. I think we have very strong family units. I think we have very entrepreneurial communities in many, more than communities, cultures, very innovative and entrepreneurial cultures. So I think, again, the speed of transition is different, but it's always knowing that it's not bringing a product in and just localizing it. And one example I would give would be, I was speaking with a wonderful company in Indonesia called Nona. They do menstrual care. And they were saying that there's a perceived notion that overseas products are superior simply because they're overseas. So buying something, from a France, a Switzerland, or Spain, wherever it may be. However, they're entering the market saying, look at our quality of products and our price point is better. So they're actually looking at, the cost, which is the second most high demand concern of consumers in Southeast Asia, the first of which is convenience. But one, cost being competitive. And then two, I think people want to support local businesses, especially young people. We love, developing, the ecosystem around us, because we want those solutions near us, right? That we can take advantage of.
Yes.
So I think those would be some of the nuances of Asia, I would say, is understanding the consumer differences, behavioral and cultural. And one thing I would direct everyone to keep an eye out for with FemTech Association Asia is in the summer of 2026, we'll be releasing insights into the femtech landscape in Southeast Asia, which is looking at consumers' perspectives across 6 countries compared to the exact same report we did in 2024, to kind of see what's changed over the past 2 years. And we've also added some new parts to that. So things like AI, perceptions on AI in healthcare. What do women think?
Yes.
Perceptions on longevity and aging and healthy aging and health span. What do women think? So we have some insurance, which I told you I've been just going on and on about. So I'm very grateful for our research partner, Milu Insight, for donating the time. They're our pro bono partners. And they said, look, we want to build this for you guys. And so they're incredibly generous partners. And with that comes more knowledge about the consumers in the space and where the gaps are.
Yes.
And so I'm happy to share that report, of course, anytime with anyone.
That would be fantastic. Lindsay, you've talked about, the region, and I'm very aware, because you mentioned it also as well, that you are not from the region. You're British American. You moved to Singapore in 2020, and you started building infrastructure. Did anyone ever question whether it was your place to do that?
Probably me more than anyone else.
Yes.
I think I've never actually had that question of whether I've literally never had that question from anyone else. I've definitely thought, how can I get more people involved who are obviously from this region, which we've done, right? I mean, we're over 160 members. We have representation in 10 countries. We launched in Bhutan in November of 2024. So we are really far reaching. So, it's exciting to see that there are all these people involved in our work. And I think the first thing is to be aware of my privilege. Obviously, there are parts like, being a woman or being an entrepreneur. But the reality is, at the end of the day, I am a white woman operating in the world. And so that comes with a privilege. And so it's recognizing that, and to say that I'm not here to represent, Asian women. I'm not here to say what Asian women think and believe. I'm here to do research and to share that, objective data. I am here to, and our organization is here to connect people who can grow and learn from each other. And then lastly, I would say, it's my role to build visibility. So our 4 pillars of our organization are thought leadership, which I talked about with our research.
Yes.
Programming and events, which we do a lot of webinars or in-person events. We have another one tomorrow night. We do a lot of amplification. So it's not necessarily my job to get myself on a podcast, though I'm grateful to be here and I adore you. So this is a real pleasure for me as a friend. But moreover, I always try to bring people with me. Here are the actual people you should be speaking with in the region, not me. I'll give you the overview of the industry, but I can't tell you what it feels like to be an Indonesian woman starting a business in the fertility space, like Sastia Wardani of Avi Health in Indonesia and Singapore. So I really try to make sure that I am respectful of that line, that, and awareness. And I'm sure I've made mistakes. But I really feel that I try to be organization first, not individual first. I hope that the organization will continue, even if I'm not involved. I hope I'm the least relevant person in the organization. That's my goal, to be absolutely irrelevant to this organization and to this region.
Yeah. So looking back, what would you say to someone who sees a gap in a market where maybe they're an outsider? Should they build it?
Ooh, so I used to answer this question when people said, why did you start the organization?
Yes.
And I would say 3 things. I would say curiosity, purpose, and passion. I now tell people, if they're interested in starting something new, to have curiosity, passion, and purpose, and rather than passion, have a plan. So I think the big thing is to not I launched it. I had no plan. I was like, I can't even believe we're doing research with the UN and Milu Insight, and that we're having partnerships with HSBC and Accenture and AWS. I mean, I had no idea this was going to happen, right?
Yes.
I had no plan. I was just like, I'm going to connect people, and then it just, in time, I learned more and it grew. But I would say the biggest thing is, rather than looking at passion, which I guess and again, this comes with experience or age, whatever you want to say. I'm less interested in passion. I'm more interested in having a plan.
So Lindsay, actually talking about my work, which, I talk about the blind spot quite a bit. I want to talk about the blind spots. Because when I think about Asia as a market, and you mentioned it with Nona, talking about how consumers sort of have this perception that we prefer to buy products that are coming in from, say, France or Switzerland or wherever versus locally made. So I kind of think about, how do the challenges of founders who are working in these markets, and of course selling to consumers in those markets, how do their challenges differ from, say, Western founders?
That's a very, very interesting question. I think the first thing is that there's a big burden on founders here for education. There's a really, really heavy requirement for education. Less so than not because people are uneducated, but just we haven't had this topic in the press as long as we've seen it in Western Europe and the US.
Yes.
So there really is a big education. People have to really put a lot of time into their content, making sure they have the right advisors for their company, really building that credibility and content and education for the consumer. And I'll give you an example of a wonderful company out of Thailand. Again, another menstrual care company. We have lots of different companies, but I just think these are such good examples of low-tech companies that see the demand from a lot of women, right? Almost all women menstruate. So it's something that is very accessible for most women. So it's and a first port of call for FemTech or health as well.
Yes.
So Room, who runs Ira Concept out of Thailand, she's an incredible founder. She works in the space, and she said she gets so many questions about sex, pregnancy, things that aren't necessarily directly related to her solution, which are biodegradable, sustainable, high quality, incredibly functional menstrual pads. And I just think, okay, that's a great example that people don't have the resources. So a lot of the companies here that started just focusing on one topic, fertility or menopause, have quickly realized, I need to actually go bigger faster, because people are looking for me across category. So I would say that's the next thing, is that because there is so much white space in this market for anyone to enter, with very low competition still, people are actually expanding really, really quickly. So again, that goes back to your perfect point, challenge and opportunity. It's a challenge because they're like, oh gosh, I thought I was just going to do fertility. And by the way, that's not even a just. Think of all the levels of fertility, from counseling to the treatments, all of it. And then you add on that everything from, all the way through the entire lifespan of a woman. So I think a lot of it is, one, around the education, and 2, just the requirement for rapid expansion, and making sure that's done in a way that's sustainable for the business, financially sustainable, doesn't grow too fast, is making sure that it has success across different categories entered or markets entered, all of these types of things. So, and especially in Singapore, it's such a small market, as you know, from having worked internationally. It's such a small market that it's a great MVP market. But when people want to grow, they need to look to surrounding markets that are completely different. And I remember I had a journalist ask me once, what does Asia think about? And I just thought, so I said, I can't answer that because, I'm 6'1" blonde lady, American British passport holder, US. I have no and then secondly, I mean, the difference between, China, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Thailand, it goes on and on and on, right? It's a very diverse region. So I think that's the other thing that's of course a challenge is how do I expand across the region when they're so different regulations, different policies, different government engagement, different consumer wants, needs, and understanding. So it's a really matrixed region, but also again, very exciting because there's tons of space for market entry.
Yes. And the other challenge that we touched on very briefly, which is capital. I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. Where is capital actually coming from in Asia to FemTech companies right now? I mean, generally speaking, is it local investors or, impact vehicles?
Good question. Good question. So in Southeast Asia, we know that 44% of investors in FemTech in Southeast Asia are actually based in Singapore.
Right.
So Singapore, as you mentioned at the very top of our discussion, a business leader.
Yes.
We have seen that US VCs represent about 15% of FemTech investment in Southeast Asia. Something unique to Singapore that I absolutely adore is the academic institution funding. So companies like EloCare, which is in the Internet of Things and supporting women with mental health wearables. Companies like HiCura, which has an AI-driven epidural. And that's, of course, for pregnancy, but also for surgery. So really a special piece. And actually, Singapore academic institutions invested in these startups. We have incubators and accelerators. We all know Y Combinator. They invested in tubeless fertility, which is a medical device for fertility. And then, of course, Antler, which is global, but Antler local, invested in Zora Health. Again, another fertility platform that has quickly grown. And now they're in the menopause space. They're in men's health even because, the fertility journey and so much of our health journeys aren't just about us. It's how we are in our surroundings, our parents, our husbands, our brothers, cousins, etc. So those are just a few of the examples. And then I should actually really acknowledge a special company that I think is going to be huge and expanding is Kindred Health out of the Philippines. They had the first publicly disclosed VC funding led by Integra Ventures in the Philippines. This company is fantastic. It is run by an amazing CEO. She is a nurse and has now opened hybrid clinics. I mean, it is one opening after another. And then you add on top of that, they have, the online support. They have, a really safe space where people can go and not feel like they're in this clinic. Rather, it's a really comfortable space where, healthcare is not intimidating. So a lot of credit to Jessica de Mesa in the Philippines and Kindred Health.
Yeah. So if you look ahead 3 to say 5 years from now, what would be your prediction about FemTech in Asia or Southeast Asia? Yes.
Predictions. Good one. First of all, let me think. I mean, Singapore, I think over the next 5 to 10 years will continue to be the leader in investment, continue to be the leader in business startups, just because it's a favorable business environment and a lot of the money is here, or coming here with VCs, et cetera. However, what I did want to say and do want to share is I think we're going to see a lot more government involvement in women's health in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, the Philippines. We can see trends already in those markets. I think we're going to see a lot of growth out of South Korea. There's a real ramping up of startups there and founders getting more involved. And then one thing I am looking out for and I'm really interested in, and I would love to do more research on this, potentially with a friend of mine who runs Ultraviolet Agency, I hope, is looking at the frontier markets. So what I'm most curious about is isn't the markets where we've already seen the trends. It's the markets that no one's talking about yet. We look at like a Cambodia, a Laos, how is women's health being integrated into these markets? As far as the changes, I think we're going to see a lot more AI, of course, a lot more precision medicine and intelligent tracking that is going to allow more discussions between doctor and patient on a platform. So I think we'll see a lot more kind of platform-based tools coming to market as well. So there's a lot to see, but I hope that we get to talk in 5 years and we can say, oh, Lindsay was so right.
Well, and we're going to do it, Lindsay. We are going to do it. Yeah. Lindsay, one last thing. I mean, we could go on, but one last thing. Building in women's health is hard.
Yeah.
On the hard days, what keeps you doing this?
Well, I think genuinely, and this isn't just because I'm on the phone with you, the community is awesome. Like I meet amazing people. So from a selfish perspective, I love and value and really I'm so grateful for the opportunities to meet so many people and do so many amazing things that I don't think I would have done if I had stayed in the luxury space, which I still work in during the day. So there's always a day job, right, to support our work in women's health. So I'm grateful on a selfish perspective with that, and that's what keeps me going. But on a community level, which I'm most passionate about, what really does keep me going is I get so excited when I see a win.
Yes.
When I see, Rosalind DX, one of our companies, founded by Ella Fung and her co-founder, they were out in San Francisco at JPM. They won 3rd place in a startup competition. Like that's a win for everyone in Asia, like that really is in the whole FemTech industry in Asia, because we need that visibility. And she did it. And so it's awesome to see that. So I think those wins and those celebrations that we have are those moments that we really need to keep moving forward. And I know selfishly motivated, because I love people, but I also love that people are achieving great things. And with 83% women founders or female founders in our organization, it really is going to be the women continuing to drive this forward. And I get really excited about the advancement of women and especially, closing that gap on gender health equity with the leadership here in Asia.
Absolutely. And I think to echo what you say about the wins, I think those wins are so important because it demonstrates, first of all, it helps us to demonstrate that women's health is no longer invisible. And it also helps us to attract more capital, more innovators coming into the space, because those wins demonstrate that there is value to be had, both financially and also from the social side. So more wins, and I love celebrating those wins, exactly as you say. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you so much for being here and for this conversation. I mean, for me, I read the report, or I'm still reading the report, and there's just so much to see. And it's really exciting to see the wave of change that's happening in a number of years and to see the opportunities that lie ahead. But you've really brought it to life on this conversation. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here and to do that. And for everyone listening, I mean, if this episode made you rethink how women's health markets actually get built, or if it made you think about risk, infrastructure, and where innovation really comes from, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it. It's so important for us to get the word out, to get the message out, to create the visibility for these great founders who are, building, innovating in women's health. You can find Lindsay's work through FemTech Association Asia and her newly published report with the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. It's called FemTech in Southeast Asia, Unlocking Innovation in Women's Health. We'll link everything anyway in the show notes, so you'll find it there. But you can also follow Lindsay on LinkedIn. She's very active on LinkedIn, so you can find her on LinkedIn and follow her work directly. And thank you so much for joining us and for tuning into this episode. Lindsay, thank you so much for building and for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
And to our listeners, thank you for being part of this community. Have a great day and see you next time.